Welcome to the Rippling Pages, a podcast on the craft of writing, curated and crafted by me, Liam Bishop. Today, I'm joined by Bruce Omar Yates. The title of his novel is bold, almost as bold as the heroes and villains which the main character revels in watching because he is obsessed with westerns. The Muslim Cowboy, Bruce Omar Yates' debut novel, is a little different, however. It's set in modern-day Iraq. He rides not a horse, but a camel and smokes a vape. He sets out across the desert, riding past burnt-out American tanks. But the destitution is apparent. While the lawlessness of the Western we see in films might be a bit of a myth, there is clearly a pertinent comment being made by Bruce about the world of the Muslim cowboy. But where does his fate lie, and how much can the films help him navigate this real and dangerous world? Published by Denim Books. Bruce, thank you very much for joining me, though, on the Rippling Pages. Great to have you here.
Thank you for having me, Liam. Are you kidding me? What a pleasure.
Let's get into it, but let's get into the westerns, the cowboys. The title of the novel. You see it when the book landed through the post, and you open it up and you see this really bold title. And the question has to be, why all these westerns? Why these cowboys?
Well, the cowboy, I suppose, is maybe because it's culturally the opposite of the Muslim. So I'm mixed race. So my father was English, my mother's Indian, Pathan with descent from Afghanistan. So we're Muslim, but my mother doesn't practice. But a lot of my extended family on that side does. And my father died when I was young, so my mum's side has had a big influence on me when I was growing up. At some point, I think I probably did feel like culturally Muslim in part, if that even exists. But I think on reflection, probably more culturally Indian than Muslim, but we say salam. But anyway, at one point, one of my aunts in particular was remarried and we stopped seeing her as much as we used to. And so I asked my mum why, and she said, because her new husband's Muslim. And I said, but we're Muslim. And my mum was like, yes, but we're Western. So then kind of cue this identity crisis of like, I became really interested in, the compatibility between Islam and the West and the intersection there. And so then when approaching the question of kind of how to perform work around this, the cowboy is like the exaggeration of the West. So, well, of America and so of the West. And I was doing some songwriting in Nashville around the time I was thinking about all of this stuff. So that kind of imagery was all around. I mean, I was kind of like the character there myself because I'm, kind of a London fop writing country music, cosplaying as a cowboy. So anyway, then you have that title, The Muslim Cowboy, which is kind of sexy. But beyond being sexy, I thought, oh, well, that concept of a Muslim cowboy could maybe crash those two articles of outlook together in one suffering brain and kind of help explore them both. So that's kind of how I landed on westerns.
Thank you for sharing that. So there's a lot of elements in there, but it sounds like there is a personal element to this main character. For sure. And he's nameless.
Well, that's like part of the tradition of, he's the classic man with no name, like Clint Eastwood from the Dollars films, or you sometimes have the nickname. So you have Harmonica in Once Upon a Time in the West, or I reread as well Cormac McCarthy's The Road when I was outlining this book, and that's as much Western as kind of his other work, but just in the post-apocalyptic setting. Yeah. And you have the man, that character, that protagonist is the man. So if it's good enough for Cormac.
Well, definitely, yeah. And this is the second podcast in a row, Cormac McCarthy's The Road has been mentioned. But
I mean, it's fabulous.
But you describe him as he speaks in English and his words come out strained in an accent locked between the Arabian stop and the American drawl. But he doesn't speak a lot, and that is what I kind of did identify from that kind of Western archetype.
But you definitely have I had to make him like this archetypal stranger, who kind of emerges from the desert and then rides off back into it. My first editor on the book, Tim Binding, when I was talking about it with him, he told me that there are three component parts to the classic Western. You've got the stranger, the horse, and the child. Without any one of those three, it kind of falls apart, like a chair might only stand with three legs. So yeah, my cowboy kind of had to be that stranger. So, I mean, there should be hints as well. So like that was another thing Tim said that I thought was really interesting about in the movie Shane, which is another movie that I refer to in the book. Shane, early on, once he's arrived at the Starretts, he thanks Mrs. Starrett for the elegant meal. And even though we know so little about him on his arrival, that one line, kind of calling the meal elegant, tells us so much about where he's been until he has arrived on the screen. So yeah, while we don't necessarily know anything about him or don't get that much insight, there are kind of little clues.
Yeah, the wonder kind of coming into the town and without a lot of physical baggage, but perhaps personal baggage, maybe the
yeah, exactly.
History, isn't there? There's a history alluded to. So I guess I'm just thinking about. So you said that you were in. I'm just thinking about you starting this book then, and you're in Nashville. You said you were writing music, and you were surrounded by these. I suspect I've not been to Nashville, but cowboy paraphernalia.
Yeah, very,
How much
very
did
much
those?
so.
Yeah, how much did those feelings sort of manifest? Well, what were you kind of experiencing then at the time that kind of fed into this book?
Well, I was writing country music out there. I mean, country music is it's filled with all of this imagery. So it was just kind of very much top of mind for me. At the same time, I was getting the sense that I wasn't really getting along with songwriting. It's a very high stress creative discipline. You're kind of meeting someone new every day, and having to be very immediately vulnerable in front of them. And 99 days out of 100, you don't come up with anything good in the studio. And so I was thinking about, maybe writing something longer. It's a little bit, lower stress. And, with a novel, you kind of have the outline and you have the guiding principle kind of following that. So if you have a bad day of writing, it kind of is swallowed in with the rest. You don't have that kind of intense level of disappointment if you don't have a good day.
Songwriting would be so intense.
It's brutal. I'm as a person, I'm not kind of that immediately. I don't know. Maybe I'm not that plugged into whatever that creative spirit is that you can pluck things out of the ether. So it's much nicer to kind of lie back on this web of outline for me.
I mean, what was the main difference between the sort of songs you were writing and?
I found that I was better suited to writing prose. Really, I mean, I had a little bit of success songwriting. David Foster Wallace says that every writer has something that they were all most good at, and for him it was playing tennis. I think Zadie Smith, it was tap dancing, and I suppose songwriting was probably that for me. And I found what I feel like I'm better suited to.
Times, so with this character is called the American. Sometimes it's called the man. Obviously, it might be an American national, but obviously there is. He has an interesting identity, doesn't he? Despite us not knowing too much about him. And what you've done, you've transposed this idea of a Western to some extent, or certainly tropes from it, onto kind of contemporary post-war Iraq. Why did you think Iraq was the place for this novel?
Well, I was a kid when 9/11 happened. So the US invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, they were a big part of growing up for me, as they were for us all. So it's something that, I was very aware of it. But really, I think I felt I could justify the character's existence in post-war Iraq. The concept of a Muslim cowboy was the first thing that came. And then post-war Iraq, I felt it's a historical setting, which I like it when I like novels that are situated in a historical setting like you have. But I felt like post-war Iraq, you have American influence, so there's like the potential for that kind of specific cultural exchange. And then when I realized that his being possessed by Western films could make him something like a modern Don Quixote, I thought, oh, okay, well, that's sexy too. And then you start doing research and reading the oral histories and looking at the situation there through a Western lens. I started, like a wild Western lens. I started noticing these really crazy equivalences that the situation there has with the classic wild Western setting. So, like, of course, they're like superficially similar with open desert landscapes and sense of freedom. danger and isolation. But beyond that, there are these like really weird like trope. There are literally US wanted posters of terrorists on the walls of the tea houses. You have factions of militia roaming the deserts, like, you know, Union, Confederate soldiers. You have bandits literally holding up trains. And you even have the Chinese government moved in to take advantage of the mess as well. So they're building a railway through Iraq. And even that evokes like the Chinese railroad laborers you see in old Wild West settings. So despite it being such a heavy place to write about, there was so much there to play with. And once you discover all that, it starts kind of writing itself, you know. You're really then in just service of the idea.
So that's all factual. That is what you researched and found that was sort of going on.
It's all true, yeah. It's crazy. Yeah,
it sounds really like weird. A Western, doesn't it? It sounds like if you watch a Western, the wanted posters on the saloons, the railroads seem to feature so much, the construction of the railroads.
It's not normal, Liam. You're like, okay, well, I have to write this, but it's begging to be written. And it just has this frontier-ness to it, you know, a place like in flux.
Well, whatever it is, there's a lot of division. You know, there's everywhere. There's Americans and there's Americans and Iraqis, East and West, Sunni and Shia, Muslims. But what it does make it difficult. It's very difficult to sort of know if or who the enemy is supposed to be, who you intend the enemy, who they should be.
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, we tend to look at things in binary terms when we're thrown into confusion. And maybe that's because the world is kind of built on binary, isn't it? So you go back to the basics. But especially in the culture today, every issue is kind of binary. One thing that surprised me when I was writing the book is that I found it wouldn't like entirely condemn or celebrate any side as it went along. And instead, it was kind of oscillating in sympathy between the two. So talking about like the East and West thing or the Americans and Iraqi thing, there's definitely a sense of cultural imperialism going on. You know, the country and the character have suffered from this invasion. But on the other hand, and on perhaps an ideological level, it's the lessons the character picks up from his heroes in the Western movies that enable him to break through and find meaning in the middle of all this chaos.
Yeah, is that what is that a comment then about, if you don't mind me asking, is that a comment about the idea of sort of a cowboy in the Western, or is that just a comment about kind of novel writing itself? Is it kind of about a cowboy, the cowboy trying to find meaning in the world, or is it more about you trying to find meaning through this novel of the world?
I've certainly felt torn personally between, you know, my Westernness and my heritage, coming from a Muslim family. And it was writing the book was definitely to do with me figuring out, okay, you know, where do I stand? How am I supposed to feel about any of this stuff? Because, you know, it's not an easy thing to talk about, compatibility between Islam and the West. And I think a lot of discussion about it does tend to descend into, you know, this kind of binary argument, like everything these days does. You know, nothing's ever as black and white as that. And I think a little bit of nuance is really important. And especially when you're writing a novel, your research is, you're reading oral histories from people on either side. And so it's very easy to find sympathies with both. If nothing else, I suppose that kind of nuance is an antidote to this kind of binary side taking that goes on, which which isn't healthy. And it's probably that's a lot to do with social media and clickbaiting and all of this kind of thing. But that's kind of another story, I suppose.
What kind of, I mean, let's say what I'm thinking about. So I'm thinking about Shane, the film, and there's that moment in the film where the conflict is going to happen, and the father is preparing to go out and fight, and the mother's getting upset, and the child is sort of running around. It's that same way you can hear him shouting bang, 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 and he's playing with the gun, and he loves this idea of Shane, doesn't he? He loves who he is and loves what he represents. Do you think these debates around sort of there's loads in there in Shane about sort of land and ownership and who owns what, and it's do these questions about division? Do you think that they will always boil down to violence?
In the frontier situation that opportunity creates, and the blending between the old and the new, these kind of things, I think there's always going to be conflict, and as long as there's conflict, there's going to be violence. It's like as old as the world,
Yeah, yes. Big question for you to answer, to be fair, Bruce.
I know that Bruce off the cuff is the worst Bruce. Bruce with his mouth shut is Bruce having looked at the mirror and thought, okay, I don't know how to answer this question. And then Bruce on paper is kind of Bruce returned to with revision. And that's why I've written a book about it, I suppose.
What we're going to do now is going to have a quick break, but do come back for the second part where Bruce will talk a little bit more, I hope, about his novel, The Muslim Cowboy. If you're enjoying today's episode, why not leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast provider? Doing so increases the visibility of the episode and in turn produces these fantastic, wonderful books that are written by writers such as Bruce that appear on the Rippling pages. Thanks very much, and I look forward to the second half with you. Thanks very much for joining us. Let's get back into it, Bruce. Obviously, there are these kind of surrounding big themes, but at the heart of it is this sweet and, I think is a sweet relationship between Cowboy and Nadia, as well as his camel, Hosty. I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about those other characters.
Yeah, well, they are the archetypes of, stranger, child, and horse. I did feel that, obviously I did a lot of research and a lot of reading about the geopolitics and the situation in Iraq, so I was informed and could tell the truth about it. But I did feel like that setting would do what it would without me worrying about it, almost, as long as I was informed. And I felt that if I could tell a good Western story, kind of the rest would follow. And the intersection between Islam and the West, those are complicated things. So focusing on the story was a way to see what might emerge about those things as I went. So yeah, it's just stranger, horse, and child.
They're a bit more than that, aren't they? They are a little bit more than that, aren't they?
Yeah. That's just then, the human story. There was an early draft where there was a lot more Iraq there, but I cut a lot of it out because, I do feel like a piece of art should have one strong idea. This one had to be, this is a Western, rather than, this is a Western and a documentary about post-war Iraq. So, yeah. And actually, I did find myself in that situation that you hear about where, the characters kind of take the story and write it for you. My cowboy was just called the Man to begin with, and it was Nadia who gave him the nickname of the American. That was just one of those things that happened, and I thought it was cute. So yeah, went with it.
Yeah, how does I don't know if you could just give listeners a bit of an insight into how Nadia is found and how they become.
So she's a little girl who the cowboy happens upon in a town, and she's orphaned, and so he sees this as his opportunity to have his own Western story. So he takes her along with him, and they go on. Obviously, he's riding on his camel, who is a huge character as well, Hosty. And for him, I kind of really wanted him to be like, you watch these Disney movies and you have, I don't know, like the rug in Aladdin, which has so much personality, or Pegasus in Disney's Hercules. You know, these kind of sidekick characters that just have so much to them. So I wanted the character to kind of the camel to kind of be like that, be a little bit more than just a camel, but to be, you know, an important part of their journey.
So funny that you say that. Because I kind of saw him, but I did see this camel. He's kind of cute, kind of bug-eyed, animated thing. But he has,
yeah.
so again, this is that thing, though, isn't it? You've kind of given something. There's not a lot of dialogue in this book, and you've given so much responsibility to a character that doesn't. But there must be some things that you must be doing to really engineer that in a.
Yeah. The way I see it is that once you've got like this outline for a story, and you've got the characters, then that's all a sandbox to then, you know, it's all an opportunity for poetry, kind of. And so when I would have a scene with the camel, you're just trying to think of, like, you know, fun and different ways to describe the way he moves and the way he looks. And camels are so silly, and so funny, but also so like steadfast and loyal. So there's so much to the camel. There's so much to the camel. So it was just kind of having fun, you know, having as much fun as I could, and making it a little bit cartoonish and a little bit surreal. And I thought that would also, you know, it lends to this kind of concept of the cowboy being a bit of a Quixote. You know, you can have fun with that, and it can be a bit wacky. So yeah, it was an opportunity for that, I suppose.
Yeah, definitely. And it's so interesting to say that, I think. You know, and for anyone listening, you know, novels are often quite serious. And there's obviously a lot of serious themes in this, but you can still have fun and enjoy it. And I think that I don't think we talk about that enough, really. That it can be a process as where, yeah, there are these fun elements, but it's vital to this novel, isn't it? It's vital to, without the camel, it wouldn't be the same novel. It wouldn't be the same in all its forms, in all its different registers and mode that your novel evokes, because it does evoke a lot. It does evoke a lot. There are these, yeah, there is these every things, but there's sadness, there's happiness, there's joy, there's this kind of fun element too, and that's what I mean. It is a, you know, a read that takes you on a journey in, and there's a lot of payoff from that, I would say.
Thanks, Liam. I think it's also part of that this oscillation, you know, between, if you're oscillating, you know, between sides in, you know, in the conflict, you're also oscillating in tone between serious and fun, heaviness and levity. So it's kind of all part of it.
Yeah, and then we see them getting chased through the desert. We see them, you know, in these sort of gunfights, and you know, I really hope that they get through this and that they come out of it alive. And the responsibility of the cowboy to look after Nadia, but she also looks after him in different ways too. It's an interesting dynamic. So it must have been a challenging. That must have been a challenge too, actually, to write about that dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of an archetype as well. It's like tropey. You have the main hero who's, I suppose I probably got that from Lucky Luke, which is this comic book. And I remember his horse was always bailing him out of situations. If the cowboy is a Quixote, then he's kind of a little bit of a he's a bit of an idiot, you know, kind of a noble fool. And then someone has to save the day. So you have Nadia there, who's a little bit more, sure of herself.
Yeah, well, you have, we've spoken about Westerns and we've spoken about the context, but you have quoted a lot of films, and you quote a lot of films in this book. And I like this idea of quoting, and you're very explicit talking, and you're very explicit in the book of the kind of, you know, what films you are phrasing or quoting or making references to. And that just made me think a little bit about how, you know, the Western, a lot of things, especially something like Once Upon a Time in the West, which you do mention a bit too, is a lot of pastiche. There's lots of quotes in there to other films.
Yeah.
I mean, which might be the filmmaker's mode, to be fair. But I just think you explicitly well, the characters are watching the films in the book and they're taking lessons from it, and it's similar to what you've done, I guess, to some extent. I guess I want to know about that choice though, to really just be quite explicit in, because it takes the prose in a different way, in a kind of an alternate direction when you start to just sort of explicitly say, it reminds them of scenes from this particular film. I guess I'm curious about that explicit choice.
Yeah, I refer to Once Upon a Time in the West first, because of that pastiche thing that it's known for. Because that was something I was going to do as well in the book. But with all the references to the films, it's like you're showing the cowboy's obsession, showing him watch something, and then showing him act it out, or showing where such and such plot point down the line comes from. I mean, to some extent, that's just part of the deal, I guess. Like writing today, it's like what, postmodern, metamodern, I don't know, building a composite, having it mean something on its own. But also for the characters to see everything through the lens of the Western, or to have the reader see everything through the lens. Well, have the reader meet post-war Iraq through the lens of the Western. We're familiar with the Western. We're familiar with the tropes, the violence, the bravery. Looking at something we're unfamiliar with through a familiar lens, it's like we can empathize with it more easily, I suppose. We can empathize with the plights of the people there who we might otherwise not have seen necessarily. We're instantly allied with their story in a way. So we have a kind of an instant understanding, or like frame of reference for what they're going through.
Yeah, definitely. I hadn't thought of it like that, but I guess it's making me think often that in a film like Shane or Once Upon a Time in the West, there is a kind of there's more at stake, isn't there, than there is for the protagonist. It's not just about a battle between two people. There's often a city or a town. Well, not a city, but there's a town at stake, isn't there, where people that are going to potentially lose out or suffer, and that is happening, isn't it? In the novel, there's a lot of other people suffering.
Yeah, it's a way in, for us, if we're in the West, if we're not familiar necessarily with, don't know, oh, these are a different kind of people. Really, they're not. They're going through, this is a frontier situation similar to the one in the Wild West. We might identify more easily with what they're going through. I don't know.
Yeah. I find it interesting. That must have been really hard, like literally right.
I actually had written I had written a lot of these scenes, quoting directly from the film, but I think that was going to be an issue with copyright or something.
Okay.
So then I had to rework them, because I definitely wanted to refer quite explicitly to the films.
Just thinking about the act of watching these films, which is what they do a lot of. So there's lots of action in this film. They're also watching lots of action. And it's something that seems to... I just want to kind of ask about the act show these people watching something, if that makes sense.
You also get those scenes as well. They're not only showing, hinting at kind of plot points to come, but they're also, every scene is a character moment as well. So you have, they're watching a I don't know, True Grit or something. But it's how they're watching it, and the cowboy and Nadia and the girl. Maybe the cowboy's made a decision that Nadia's not happy with, and so she watches it in a certain way, and she behaves in a certain way. Or maybe there's a scene where they're getting used to each other, and they're sat close together, and just that kind of exposition. Every scene is, also an opportunity for character development, I suppose you'd say.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that would be quite a hard thing to achieve. They're not doing on the surface, they're not really doing too much, but it brings them, it seems to do so many things. It brings them together, it gives them lessons, whether they're like the right lessons or not. And at times it seems to sort of comfort them.
That's the other thing that you get to play with is should they be acting out some of these things? You get a sense with Nadia, I think, that you know, as she gets to know the cowboy more, you know, she kind of wants to do what he's doing, and for better or worse, I suppose.
I mean, there is at the heart of this a very uh, warming story. There is this relationship between these two characters amidst this world of conflicts, trauma. You know, we can't put it too lightly, I don't think, but there is a sweet story at the heart of this. And as you said, there are some fun elements to it as well. Bruce, what have you got lined up? Where do you go after the Muslim Cowboy?
There were, you know, a lot of questions I came upon while writing this book that these characters couldn't answer. I'm fascinated in the many different ways, the even non-religious ways the Middle East and the West continue to interact and intersect. More broadly, I'm interested in the ways, you know, this kind of hurriedly globalized world we're living in is expected to interact. I'd say those are some of the things I've begun to explore in work since finishing The Muslim Cowboy.
Any more? Will you return to songwriting? Do you think? Do you think it's helped you get over?
I don't know. I feel retired from songwriting, Liam. I'm retired songwriter. I really took to prose fiction. I feel like it's the medium I should have been working in all along. So I don't know. What did the footballers say? Never say never. But I today I'd probably say I've hung up my boots in that respect.
I wondered what you were going to say then. I thought you could have got, I don't know, you could have gone for a Cantona quote.
Cantona quote about the seagulls and the trawlers. Yeah,
that's what came to mind actually. Well, a man of many talents, and the Muslim Cowboy is released on the 22nd of August. So not long now. It's published by Dead Ink Books. I've really enjoyed it. I'm sure you can hear that coming through this interview. It's yeah, there's loads to sort of take from it. But now all that we've got to say is Bruce Omar Yates, thank you very much for joining me on the Rippling Pages.
Thank you, Liam. My pleasure.